The land was quiet then. A decade I'd spent on this farm, building not just a livelihood, but a peace, a sanctuary built on sweat, calculation, and the simple understanding of boundaries. I bought this place when the adjacent acreage was just a wild, unused field. I watched it transform, slowly, into the neat, sterile uniformity of the new Silverwood subdivision, a sea of HOA-approved pastel siding and perfectly manicured, yet utterly useless, lawn. Stop my side, however, remained rooted in reality. A working farm. My field stretched out, rugged and purposeful, clearly demarcated by an old hedgerow and an aged, moss-covered wire fence that, while not imposing, was always respected. It wasn't just a physical marker. It was the line between their synthetic, rule-bound world and my honest, dirt-under-the-fingernails reality. For years, we had an unspoken agreement. The farmers and the commuters, we leave each other alone. I respected their perfect, trivial order. They respected my necessity and my investment. That peace, that necessary equilibrium, was fragile, and it was the convenience of the Silverwood residents that finally broke it. The first sign was faint, a whisper of a path, appearing across the corner of my property near the old sycamore tree. A small, unofficial scar crossed the corner of my field, where the dirt was just a little too flat, the young grass just a little too pressed down. It was almost invisible at first, easily dismissed as a deer trail or a lazy wanderer. But then came the regularity. The scar deepened, becoming defined, a clear and undeniable cut-through. It was being used by a pedestrian, determined to shave a trivial distance off their commute to the main road. The user, as I soon learned, was a woman, one of the subdivision's more vocal residents, the kind who treated common rules as gospel for others, but mere suggestions for herself. She moved with an entitled speed, usually on her phone, oblivious or perhaps willfully ignorant of the fact that she was actively trespassing. She saw the space not as private property, not as the result of decades of labor, but merely as a negligible patch of dirt separating her from her destination. My initial reactions were measured. Attempts to reclaim the boundary through civility. I installed a large, professionally printed no trespassing sign, clearly visible, legally sound. It lasted 3 days before she began to deliberately walk an almost comical U-shape around it, turning the sign into a bizarre, personalized obstacle course. This wasn't merely a failure to observe the law. It was an act of contempt for the very idea of private ownership. When I finally approached her calmly, I must stress, attempting to appeal to basic neighborly courtesy, I was met with a glare of pure, distilled condescension. Her reply, delivered with a dismissive wave of her hand and an air of utter superiority, has become the infamous mantra of every entitled trespasser I have ever encountered. What's the big deal? It's just dirt. That moment solidified the conflict. It wasn't about the dirt. It was about respect. It was about the line. She had crossed the boundary not only physically, but philosophically. She had drawn the line, and she was daring me to cross it in return. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, arrogant, and relentless intrusion. And I knew, standing there, inhaling the cool, heavy air of the encroached upon field, that this piece I valued so highly would soon have to be defended. The battle for the boundary had begun. The initial trespass was an annoyance. The sustained refusal to cease was a declaration of war. After her condescending dismissal, "It's just dirt," the problem escalated from one isolated irritant to a chronic infection. She didn't just ignore my signs. She treated them like a personal challenge. I'd install a temporary barrier, a thin rope strung between 2 posts, and the very next day, the rope would be cut, or she'd simply step over it with an air of theatrical inconvenience. Her dog, often off-leash, started leaving its own territorial marks near my equipment shed. My property was being actively devalued, my right to exclusive use openly mocked. The arrogance was staggering. I learned her schedule. She timed her dash across my field to shave precisely 5 minutes off her drive, and soon, her neighbors, seeing her impunity, began to join her. First, a jogger, then a couple walking their children to the bus stop. My single scar became a communal right-of-way, a high-traffic shortcut where people felt they had an inherent right to cross my private space simply because it was the most efficient route. I shifted tactics, moving from direct confrontation to the channels I hoped would enforce order. I began a paper trail, documenting every single violation. I had my lawyer draft stern, certified cease and desist letters, addressed specifically to her and carbon copy to the HOA board. The letters, which cited property law and potential liability for accidents, were returned unanswered. The HOA, in a masterful display of bureaucratic cowardice, responded with a generic form letter stating they had no jurisdiction over private land, conveniently ignoring the fact that the trespassers were their residents. The frustration became a slow, churning fire in my gut. I spent hours on the phone with county officials, police non-emergency lines, and even zoning departments, but the consensus was always the same: no physical violence, no arrest. They saw it as a civil matter, a petty squabble over a few feet of dirt. They did not see the years of labor, the financial investment, or the principle of the matter being systematically undermined by a woman's need for 5 extra minutes of sleep. I was trapped in a system that valued decorum over property rights. This was the tipping point. The day she went past simple walking, I had planted a new trial crop, expensive, delicate seedlings critical to my year's revenue, in the very corner she favored. It had rained that morning, turning the shortcut into a sloppy mess. Rather than walk through the mud, she drove her small SUV slightly off the established dirt path, a deviation of mere feet to avoid splashing her shoes. That minor deviation was enough. The thin wheels utterly pulverized an entire row of seedlings, worth thousands of dollars and weeks of preparation. When I saw the tire tracks, deep and unmistakable, cutting directly through my future earnings, the rage was cold. It was the absolute, unanswerable proof that her disregard was not passive, it was active destruction. It was an act of aggression against my livelihood, born from a profound, entitled contempt for anything that was not her own comfort. The law had failed me. Civility had failed me. Diplomacy had failed me. I realized that my problem was not a legal dispute. It was a defense problem. To protect my property, I needed a solution that spoke a language she understood, a language of undeniable, instant consequence. The time for talking, for signs, and for letters was over. The rage had vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. This was no longer about revenge. It was about defense, pure and simple. I wasn't seeking injury. I was enforcing a boundary with a language that transcended polite warnings and ignored court summons. I needed a deterrent that spoke directly to the trespasser's sense of self-preservation, something that would stop them dead in their tracks without causing irreversible harm. The spikes were not the tool of a madman, but the last resort of a man abandoned by the system. My plan was meticulous. I researched the exact trajectory of her car, the path she took to avoid the muddy shortcut after the rain. I studied the physics of a tire under impact. The goal was simple: disable the vehicle, force a stop, and deliver an undeniable message, all while minimizing the risk of severe injury to the driver. I used crude metal scraps and heavy-gauge rebar, welding them into rough, angled pyramids. They were designed to puncture, not to rip, to deflate a tire instantly, not to shred the whole wheel. Well, the placement was key. I worked under the pre-dawn darkness, the silence of the farm acting as my accomplice. I dug shallow trenches along the exact, invisible line of her habitual cut-through, placing the metal defense meticulously. I buried them just below the surface, camouflaging them with the dirt and loose straw I'd swept aside. The surface tension of the ground was enough to hold them stable, waiting for the weight of a passing car. They were invisible, perfectly positioned for the one who refused to look down, who refused to respect the ground they insisted on walking, and now driving over. This action carried weight, and I felt it. There was a moment of profound hesitation, standing alone in the dark, my hands slick with sweat and oil, looking at the silent, hidden field of metallic teeth. I was violating my own code, moving from lawful protection to unilateral enforcement. But the memory of the crushed seedlings, my honest work destroyed by frivolous arrogance, steeled my resolve. The cost of doing nothing had become too high. I was not setting a trap for a neighbor. I was setting a minefield for a relentless invader. And in the absence of a willing police force, I had become the boundary itself. The deed was finished as the sun began to paint the horizon. The field looked peaceful, beautiful, and utterly harmless. The rising light revealed a landscape of deception, perfectly calm but primed for consequence. I retreated to the house, not with triumph, but with a heavy, necessary finality, to wait for the inevitable. I had taken an action I could not undo, trading my peace for a fragile, enforced stillness. The trap was set. Now, the land would speak for itself. I sat by the window, sipping bitter coffee, the tense silence of the morning amplifying every distant chirp and rustle, waiting for the single, undeniable sound that would confirm my defense had held. The wait was agonizing. The rising sun, which had witnessed my grim work, now felt like an accusatory eye. Every distant sound a bird's call, the rumble of an early delivery truck jolted my nerves. I sat by the kitchen window, coffee grown cold in my hands, eyes fixed on that deceptively peaceful corner of my field. I wasn't waiting for justice. I was waiting for consequence. Then it came. Not the violent crash I had morbidly imagined, but a sharp, dull thwump, a sound that vibrated through the ground more than the air. It was followed almost immediately by a high-pitched, indignant shriek, not of pain, but of pure, self-righteous fury. Her car had hit the deterrent. My defense had held. I didn't rush out. I simply took a slow, deep breath. The shouting began then, a torrent of enraged accusation. I could hear her voice, piercing the morning calm, screaming about property damage, about maniacs, about attempted murder. I let her vent, let her exhaust the initial burst of indignation. When I finally walked out, my pace was measured, deliberate. I found her standing beside her small SUV, which was indeed stopped, listing dramatically to one side, its front tire clearly and utterly deflated, not shredded, not mangled, just flat, a perfect, undeniable puncture. She turned on me, a whirlwind of furious gestures and verbal assaults, demanding to know what kind of booby trap I had set. I simply pointed, calmly, to the large, official no trespassing sign, which was still firmly planted just inside my property line. My words were few, delivered in a low, even tone. This is private property. You were trespassing. I used a deterrent to protect my land. The arrival of the county sheriff's cruiser was inevitable. They found her, still agitated, pointing frantically at the flattened tire and then at me. They found me, standing composedly by my sign, explaining the documented history of trespass, the ignored warnings, the damage to my crops, and the HOA's inaction. The deputy, a pragmatic man named Miller who knew my farm, knelt to examine the punctured tire. He then retrieved one of the spikes, a crude, ugly thing, but clearly designed to puncture, not to maim. He looked from the spike to the sign, then to the distraught woman, and finally to me. There was a long silence. He asked me directly, "Did you intend to hurt her, Mr. Dawson?" My answer was immediate and honest. "No, deputy. I intended to stop her from damaging my property after every other legal means failed. The intent was deterrence, not injury." Deputy Miller sighed. He understood the nuances of rural justice better than any city official. He knew the frustration. He knew the limitations of the law when faced with persistent, petty disregard. After a thorough inspection and a few more terse exchanges, he informed her that, while the means might be unconventional, I was within my rights to protect my property from trespass. There was no intent to injure, no charges against me. He did, however, issue her a citation for trespassing, citing the long history of documented warnings. The message was clear. The law, however slowly, had finally taken my side. The aftermath was a whirlwind of local gossip and lingering resentment. The HOA, finally shamed by the public spectacle and potential incivility, sprang into action. Within a week, a crew was out, erecting a proper, high chain-link fence, complete with warning signs, along the entire border of their subdivision and my farm. The shortcut was permanently closed. The constant anxiety, the daily vigilance, finally lifted. My property was safe, secured not by my own crude spikes, but by the very system that had initially failed me, forced into action by the uncomfortable truth of its own negligence. The victory, however, felt hollow. Peace was restored? Yes, but at what cost? The ruined crops were easily replaced, but the trust in basic civility was gone. The incident had scarred not just my field, but my sense of community. I was no longer just the farmer. I was the guy who put spikes in his field. My relationship with the subdivision residents, once indifferent, was now tinged with a cold acknowledgement. I watched the new fence now, a permanent barrier where a simple hedge once stood. It's ugly, industrial, a testament to the fact that some lines must be guarded by more than just a gentleman's agreement. The lane is quiet again, truly quiet this time, no more faint paths appearing in the dawn light. But the memory of how I achieved that quiet remains. I returned to my work, the rhythm of the farm slowly stitching itself back into the fabric of my days. I learned that sometimes, to protect what is yours, you have to be willing to do the uncomfortable, the controversial, and the absolute. And that, I suppose, is the final, hard lesson of the boundary.